Hey guys, what's up? 2.7 is out, and we are going to take a look at Reza today. Reza is the new hero on the Halcyon Fold, and he is a mobile CP assassin. When I say mobile CP assassin, I mean CP. He really doesn't do well with weapon power, so let's just get that one out the way right now. Now, I think Reza could be good. He's definitely been talked of as being underpowered, but I think a lot of people need to realise where most of his damage comes from, and that comes from his heroic perk, Firestarter. Now, Reza applies Firestarter when he hits people with an A or a C, and then once you basic attack them following that, you deal damage based on your level, and it has a CP scaling ratio. That's where the majority of the burst damage comes for Reza. So I really think that just making use of that will be the best thing to his success. His A ability is called Scorcher. It's a line skill shot. It deals damage to anything that passes through it, but it stops on hitting an enemy hero or jungle monster. The thing that it stops on is what it applies Firestarter to, and so that's what you need to be aware of. You need to be aiming that at heroes and jungle monsters if you're trying to jungle with him. His B ability is, in my opinion, his best ability, and is called Troublemaker. Now, this is his dash ability. You can store up to 2 charges of it. It deals damage to anything you pass through, and then gives you an empowered basic attack. This empowered basic attack is a little bit like a weak version of Firestarter, but obviously you can get 2 of them in quick succession. That's why the damage and the scaling on it is slightly lower. His ultimate is called Netherstorm Detonator. And that essentially, after a small delay, it's about 1 second, you jump into the air, land onto a target location, and you deal damage in an area. Now, if any of those enemies has Firestarter applied, usually by using your A first, it will proc that and then reapply Firestarter to any nearby enemies, including the enemy that you procced Firestarter on in the first place. He then enters a demonic form for a small duration, and then applies Firestarters with basic attacks. Now, the good thing to get to grips with here is that you have to proc Firestarter and then reapply it. You can't proc and apply Firestarter at the same time, so what Reza will do in his demon form is if there is Firestarter on an enemy, he'll proc it, his next basic attack will apply it, and then his next basic attack after that will proc it once more, and it goes on in that cycle. Now, this is a question that I bet a lot of you wouldn't have thought about. Would Reza be good in the jungle or lane? Now, he's actually listed as a jungler, but genuinely I feel that he is stronger in lane. He needs gold to be good. He gets better gold income in the lane. He spikes quicker in the lane, and he has got B for gank escapes. It does make him more vulnerable to ranged matchups, but starting Book of Eulogies will often help you out with that. In the jungle, he's slower and safer, but he's got a very slow jungle clear, and I don't really think he wants to go Stormcrown. I don't think Reza is that good with Stormcrown, so I think by taking him into the jungle, you're kind of hampering his ability. These are the build paths in levels that I go. Versus non-mobile targets, categorically on both sides of things, I like to max B first because I think the cooldown on it and the increased basic attack damage is really good in combination with your heroic perk, which goes up with levels anyway. And your heroic perk is the major form of your damage. So by maxing B, you're just going to get the most on-hit damage and the most mobility, which is what Reza wants. Versus non-mobile targets, I then like to max A because it's a little bit more burst on more frequent cooldown, and it's more easy to hit non-mobile targets with your A, and you can apply Firestarter a little bit more quickly. Whereas versus mobile targets, I like to take my C. It comes off cooldown a little bit more often, and also does a little bit more damage, and gives you the extended duration on your Firestarter, on your applying your Firestarter in the demonic form. So those are the 2 builds that I like to go. More often than not, I max B and A, but sometimes I do like to max C if I think I need that mobility. Now let's talk about builds. If you're going in lane, which I do, I would always recommend starting with a Book of Eulogies. So I'm not going to include that here, but if you want to start lane, start Book of Eulogies. If you're going to go jungle, I think it's good to go just double Crystal Bit. So, offense. CP. I like this build here. It's very burst heavy versus squishy mobile targets. There's so many ways to apply Frostburn for Reza that you can stick to mobile targets really easily. You just have to make good use of your dash. If you waste your dash, that's one of the main reasons you'll end up failing as Reza. And if you fail to apply your heroic perk, another reason. So you have to be able to hit your A and have to be able to stick to your target, which is why I like Frostburn versus mobile targets. This is another build that I've had success with versus non-mobile targets. Again, Eve of Harvest, usually non-mobile targets trade-offs are that they do more damage or are better in sustained fights. So therefore going Eve of Harvest gives you a little bit of sustain that is necessary. So I prefer this versus non-mobile targets. It's still very burst heavy, and again it's pretty solid. You might be wondering why I'm doing 3 items only, but I'll get to that when I get to the defense section. It has to do with the fact that really Reza is just very squishy, and the burst damage trade-off right now is not high enough to warrant going 4 items, because realistically you just don't do the damage required before you die. Let's talk about some other builds that I've seen, I've talked to professional players about. This is a build that I know some junglers in EU have been testing, or some laners in EU have been testing as well. Going the Aftershock Broken Myth, it's very classic for an on-hit type CP assassin, but adding the Echo in actually allows you to get 4 dashes off. You can dash, dash, echo, dash, dash again, which makes him so ridiculously mobile and so good to chase down enemy heroes. And also, you can double ultimate. Obviously really good at avoiding CC. Double ultimate also means you can close the gap a bit more quickly too. So this is a build that I think you guys should test if you get the opportunity. There has been some success with it. It's a little bit riskier because obviously Echo you need to make good use of, and it only works when Echo is off cooldown. But then using Echo on your B means Echo is up quite often. So with Echo being buffed this update, it might be a build that works out. This is another build that I've seen work out. It's got a pretty high win rate. Again, Aftershock gives you the necessary cooldown, bits of on-hit damage, which realistically, let's talk about Reza. He is an on-hit based hero, so on-hit damage from Aftershock is only going to make his on-hit damage better. Then adding in the Shatterglass 2 does help him be a little bit more burst orientated. Now, people might be wondering, why haven't you gone the Clockwork build? Well, I don't think Clockwork's that good on Reza, personally. I don't think you play him like a Baptiste. You don't want to just spam your A. If you want to spam your A, you just play Baptiste, right? I much, much, much prefer this particular build on Reza, just simply because Clockwork, I think, only gives him cooldown reduction, and it's only 15% more cooldown reduction than what the Aftershock provides. Now, there might be a case for Aftershock Broken Myth and Clockwork itself, which gives you, huge amounts of cooldown reduction, which I definitely think is a potential build that you could work with, but I do then think you're starting to lack damage, and one of the major issues that I've run into with Reza is that he does start to lack damage. So that is a build that I think works, but I definitely don't think you need to go overkill. You can also add in a Halcyon Charges if you want the extra cooldown reduction, so that's something to think about as well. Now let's talk about his defensive itemization. Now, I think Reza needs 2 defense items, just simply because he's very, very squishy. Yes, his mobility is good, but using your B dash, you can still be attacked, and I think he's quite easily focused. You've only got one way to avoid CC, which is your ultimate, and then it also means that they can notice where you're coming down and position around you. So against an attack speed-based carry, I like going the Atlas Pauldrons. I definitely think Aegis is absolutely needed, especially if there is a CP carry on the enemy team, just simply because the reflex block will be so key to preventing you getting locked down. A hero that requires mobility is very, very vulnerable to hard CC, so that kind of locks your mobility down and makes you very vulnerable. So therefore, having the reflex block I think is absolutely necessary if you're planning to go into a composition that has a lot of hard lockdown and CC. If you're not that good at hitting Atlas, or Atlas isn't exactly required, for instance, if you're playing up against a Baron, for instance, or if you're playing up against a Kestrel that's focusing on her Glimmer Shot, then I think Metal Jacket is good too. Something that is often sort of not talked about on the current sort of meta of Vainglory is actually how Metal Jacket is really good. And with the Atlas nerfs, a lot of people actually prefer going Metal Jacket in the first place. So I quite like going Metal Jacket just simply because it just is one less thing to worry about, and often is just as good in some scenarios versus a carry anyway. But obviously if you can land Atlas, that's good. Now going into boots, if you're going down the Aftershock route and you've got a bit of cooldown reduction already, I quite like Journey Boots just because Reza is very, very basic attack focused, which means you're going to be landing basic attacks as Reza, which means you're going to be resetting the cooldown of Journey Boots, and for a hero so reliant on mobility, Journey Boots often help him out quite extensively. There is also something to consider where you can consider the Halcyon Chargers. Now, Halcyon Chargers I would consider maybe if I don't go Aftershock or I don't build a Clockwork for cooldown reduction, even though I don't usually build Clockwork in my build. Just because a little bit of cooldown reduction is actually pretty good for the dashes on his B. It helps them come off cooldown more quickly, and when I say cooldown, I mean the sort of regeneration time on them. So they get them get the charges built more quickly, and you then are sort of straying into territory where you're going more burst orientated if you don't have Aftershock anyway. So I think Halcyon charges are warranted if you don't have any cooldown reduction in your build elsewhere, but otherwise I prefer Journey Boots just because of how basic attack dependent Reza is. So Reza can actually do a couple of things when it comes to making him work. Realistically, before you fight, you really want to hit your enemies with your A because it primes your fire starter, which is the major part of your damage. You need to be making sure that that gets applied to targets that you want to hit. You can then follow up by using your B to dash in, and then you want to stick to them with that B and use your ultimate to clear the gap as well. The more you can apply fire starter, the better damage output that you're going to have. So always try and start a fight by landing your A or landing your C. Obviously, you can engage your fights with C, although I wouldn't recommend it. Now, coming on to C, I think his ultimate has a couple of uses. It's really good at chasing down targets, but another part of it can be used to dodge CC. You can use it to dodge things like Vox's silence, you can use it to dodge things like Catherine's silence, Fearsome Shade from Batiste. It's a really good way of avoiding crowd control, and I think that's something that's really important to Reza, so it's a really good way to just stop yourself getting locked up by those specific abilities. I think that's something that should always be paid attention to. When you're in the middle of a team fight. Other things about Reza, he can jump walls with his dash. Now that will be a separate video because it's going to take quite long to do, but I will show you the walls that Reza can dash over. But otherwise, you know, he's got a lot of comboing. Most of Reza's damage comes from his ability to combo and chain together skills. And that's specifically because all of his damage comes from his heroic perk, really. So you want to be able to chain together your A and your basic attacks to try and get your heroic perk up. You want to then be able to dash in and apply it, which gives you an extra basic attack damage because your B provides you a separate on-hit bonus. So I think really important to be able to combo your abilities to make Reza work. And again, his ultimate's very good at following up as well. You'll see here I actually use it to be able to follow up and just get the kill. You can just use it to essentially secure things on your end. So Reza is actually a pretty good mobile assassin. Now, he's very good into squishy targets. He's very good into immobile squishy targets. Frostburn can make him good into mobile ones. He's very bad against sustained duelists, though. So he's going to suck versus things like Rona, suck versus things like Cruel. So I wouldn't pick him in those kind of scenarios. But in lane, he can do well against things like Celeste. He can do well against things like Vox, Ringo, Scarf. So all of those matchups are pretty good for him. Now, this is a very small initial guide. It's based on some testing that I did in just one day. I will try and update this in a best heroes of 2.7 where I'll change the builds for Reza if he comes into it, or I'll just do an updated Reza, a small sort of 5-minute look over Reza in a week's time just to see if anything's changed. Hope you guys have enjoyed it, and if you get the chance, go and check out Reza.